Or giving faculty advice about their own research on transfer, I think I would, first of all, recommend that they think very carefully about what they mean by transfer and to interrogate their own assumptions about transfer. We know that transfer is actually a very complicated phenomenon. We know that many assumptions about transfer actually are too reductive and are set up almost any research to prove that learning doesn't happen and learning doesn't carry over. So it's very important to understand your own assumptions and not just begin with the definition of transfer that you think obtains. A counterweight to that would be to not be paralyzed by the complexity of transfer, or else you wouldn't know what it is you're trying to study. I think we've learned that transfer does happen. Transfer, repurposing, integration does happen in many different ways in many different contexts. So it's very important, I think, to feel that you can be asking certain kinds of questions and finding evidence. And then I think I've learned from participating in the seminar and watching the amazing research teams do their work is that balance of focus and complex perspective is exactly the balance that's needed to make sense of evidence as you move forward with your research project. As in all research projects, and especially scholarship of teaching and learning projects, you have to be very clear what it is you're looking for and be very open to what Lee Schulman always used to emphasize as surprise. If you're not open to surprise in your research, then you're really not approaching it in the right way.
There are always concepts that help us become part of a community of practice, and the more expert we are in these communities of practice, the less visible the concepts are, or the practices are. And so as we start to think about transfer study, or transfer theory, one of the really important cathartic and helpful things is to recognize that we have all these practices that seem so natural and commonsensical to us, and yet are so learned and practiced. And so one of the really important steps of transfer work is to really dig into our own practices and think about what are they, what do they privilege, what values do they reflect in our community, and see them as subjects of study and not as natural things, as in some sense as unnatural things, as Sam Warrenberg would say.
If you're coming to the transfer research and you haven't been reading it or thinking about it up until then, you kind of walk into it thinking that you understand it, right? That you know what we're talking about here. I mean, by we, I mean all of us. We all use the word transfer. And so you sort of walk in and say, okay, well, I know, I'm just kind of interested in how transfer happens. And so I think if you're new to this, one of the things you might want to do is really start looking at how different kinds of people define transfer, and that it really has been questioned and complicated a lot in terms of not just being static, not just being present moment, not just being individual. And maybe a good place to start with that is the Engstrom book, Between School and Work, because they lay out in an early chapter sort of different ways to look at transfer that I think is really helpful if a person is coming to this for the first time.
We have learned a lot from watching people study transfer in the writing context. So they've been looking at how do you understand writing transfer and what students learn in one context about writing works in another context or in another time during the same year in their academic experience. And we're trying to take what we've learned from that research experience and tease it out for other aspects of the educational experience. So a couple tips that we have are things like try to work with other people. The more institutions that you can represent in a project, the more disciplines you can represent, the more you actually learn about what really is happening in each of the students' contexts for learning. If we just look at one disciplinary perspective or just one institutional context, we may be finding some really interesting things about that context or that discipline, but we're not necessarily learning about what's generalizable. So the more that our participants worked with other people, the more they were able to see that, oh look, the setting is really different and that does make a difference. Or our students are really different. They bring different prior knowledge, different prior experiences, and that really does make a difference. So the more that you can work with other people in other disciplines, other institutions, the more perspective you're going to get, the fuller understanding you're going to get, And the more you'll understand about what's specific to one setting versus what's generalizable to student learning more broadly.
As I said, collaboration was extraordinary. Not just because of the things that we could do together, but also because of the things that we realized that we couldn't do together. Because it was this is a very different setting for someone in Denmark teaching PhD students, someone in Michigan teaching mostly mostly Chinese students who are learning English as a foreign language, and I'm teaching mostly American students who are learning Spanish. So the settings were so different, but the idea of finding one thing that really united all of us, and also one kind of passion that united all of us, was very nice. That was what was unique in our group, that it was so international, and we kind of worked in different, we all taught languages, but different languages to different kinds of students. And our objectives when teaching were very different, goals and also outcomes and everything. But we still, we still managed to collaborate, and it was nice. And I don't think such collaborations are very common or happen very often. One of the things that when I started working on this project, I realized was that foreign languages is kind of separated from teaching of English as a second language. We all both kind of teach the same thing. We teach foreign language, whether it's English for some people in Spanish or Chinese or whatever. For others, it doesn't matter. The method is can be the same. So it was interesting to see that someone who was coming from an ESL perspective and someone who was coming from a foreign languages perspective, and some people from Europe who didn't have either of this, found a theme and found something, that tied their project together and made it happen.
Another thing that we've learned is that it helps to have multiple methods. People may bring different strengths. They may bring some research methods from the humanities. They may bring them from the social sciences. Bringing those together actually gives us a much richer understanding of what's happening. It gives us more ways to describe what student learning is occurring, how students are processing what they're learning, and it gives us enough different types of evidence that we can really tease out specifics. We can tease out things with more certainty, and we can also say where there's more uncertainty.